The forest lay under a blanket of thick, unmoving fog, a gray weight that pressed down on the earth until every sound felt muted and every shadow stretched unnaturally long. In that oppressive silence, a single figure moved cautiously between the pines. One young scout, carrying nothing more remarkable than a small pack of brush, a battered compass, and a quiet determination. Days of endless marching had stripped the land of all familiar shapes. Paths had collapsed under fallen trees, ridgelines had shifted from bombardments, and the terrain felt almost hostile in its indifference. Somewhere out there, beyond the broken branches and the pale mist, 300 men had disappeared as if swallowed by the earth itself. Earlier that morning, when the scout first suggested using smoke to re-establish contact, the idea had been brushed aside with laughter. A childish trick, they called it, the kind you might see in a field manual written decades before, or in the hands of inexperienced recruits playing at survival. But as the sun dipped behind the clouds, turning the sky into a dim, colorless wash, every other tool had failed them. Radios crackled with useless static, flares had run out, the terrain allowed no vantage point, and the forest, shifting, deceptive, alive with its own quiet menace, was steadily erasing any faint trace of the missing soldier's passage. Now, as the scout knelt on the cold, damp ground and lit the first spark, the flame caught with a hesitant breath. Smoke curled upward, fragile at first, then stronger, rising through fractured beams of fading daylight. It was the simplest signal on Earth, primitive, unsophisticated, but in that moment it was the only hope left. And somewhere deep in the maze of ravines and fog, a pair of tired eyes would soon lift toward that drifting column, realizing that someone was calling them home. The day had begun with false confidence. Maps suggested an uncomplicated approach toward the ridge, and the corridor they were to follow was marked as safe, a narrow valley that had been scouted days before. But the forest had transformed since then. Artillery strikes had uprooted ancient trees and reshaped the ground into unpredictable slopes. Fog settled thickly at dawn and refused to move, turning the world into a pale, shifting maze where even experienced officers struggled to recognize landmarks. The scout noticed the unease first, watching the formation drift ever so slightly off their intended path. Subtle signs, a change in the slope beneath his feet, tree trunks spaced unnaturally close, the faint smell of stagnant marsh nearby, warned him that the unit was slipping into dangerous ground. Others dismissed these observations as overcaution. Yet by midday, whole squads reported that their bearings no longer aligned with the maps, and echoes in the gorge distorted voices, making orientation nearly impossible. When word reached command that 300 men had disappeared entirely, no signals, no trail, no response to hails, the atmosphere shifted from irritation to dread. The forest was vast, unforgiving. In conditions like this, even trained units could vanish in a matter of hours. The scout felt the weight of the growing silence, sensing that those men were no longer simply lost. They were trapped somewhere the forest did not intend to give back easily. Instinct had always been the scout's most reliable tool, stronger than the instruments assigned to him. Growing up in rugged country, he learned to read the landscape through sensations others considered insignificant. A shift in wind temperature, the direction humidity settled, the way broken twigs pointed along a slope. These details formed an unspoken language. In the military, these talents were often underestimated, overshadowed by more technical methods. Men teased him for relying on what they called childish woodcraft. But as he pushed deeper into the thickening fog, those instincts became his only guide. He studied faint prints that softened under moisture, followed broken branches whose edges hadn't yet darkened, and examined patches of disturbed soil where dozens of boots had recently passed. Each clue dissolved quickly in the damp air, Yet he pieced them together, walking with the urgency of someone who knew the price of hesitation. As the trail led him into a narrow gorge, the air grew cold and unnervingly still. The fog thickened into ghost-like curtains that clung to the ground. Even birds had gone silent. It was a place where men could become disoriented in minutes, losing all sense of direction, even hope. The scout tightened his grip on his pack. The forest was swallowing the lost column, and if he didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to find. Back at the command post, frustration escalated into fear. Every rescue attempt sent into the gorge returned confused and empty-handed. Maps no longer reflected reality. Landmarks had shifted or disappeared. Officers argued over terrain interpretation, some insisting the missing unit had veered east, others west. The only consistent truth was that no radio message reached them. No signal returned. The scout arrived with his observations, detailed, methodical, urgent. But as soon as he explained that he was reading terrain signs rather than relying solely on instruments, some officers reacted with skepticism. In wartime, men clung to certainty, and instinct felt too fragile, too unpredictable. What they wanted were coordinates, grid lines, and verifiable data, none of which the scout could provide. Yet he couldn't ignore the reality he felt in his bones. The lost soldiers were close, but slipping further into danger with every passing hour. The radio operators worked frantically, adjusting dials, swapping batteries, whispering prayers to spark life into the static-ridden sets. Nothing worked. Light was fading, options were dwindling, and the scout knew the final opportunity to save those men was nearing its end. When he proposed the smoke signal, the reaction was immediate and dismissive. Officers exchanged doubtful glances. Some smirked. Others shook their heads. Smoke? In the middle of enemy territory? In weather where humidity choked the air and fog hovered like wet cloth beneath the canopy? It seemed absurd, even reckless. The scout held his ground. He explained how smoke behaved in damp air, how certain types of brush produced dense plumes that traveled vertically, even under low wind, how dark smoke could cut through pale fog and reach the eyes of anyone searching desperately for a landmark. But to the officers, it sounded like superstition, like a relic of old survival guides, rather than a dependable method in a modern conflict. Still, the alternatives were exhausted. No flares, no long-range radios, no clear vantage points. The forest had robbed them of every conventional tool. After a long silence, the commanding officer finally conceded, not out of confidence, but out of desperate resignation. "Try it," he said softly. The scout didn't waste a single second. He navigated through steep, slippery roots and fallen logs until he reached the modest rise he'd spotted earlier, a small swell of earth barely tall enough to serve as a signal point, but just high enough to push smoke above the nearest branches. The ground squished under his boots, releasing the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves. Though the ridge wasn't much, to him it felt like a lifeline. He arranged damp and dry materials with precision, building a layered pile that would produce both flame and thick, visible smoke. Damp brush for heavy plumes, dry sticks for heat, canvas scraps for darkening the smoke. The forest was silent, except for his steady movements. The fog swirled around him as if uncertain whether to reveal the rising plume or swallow it whole. When he struck the match, the tiny flame reflected briefly in his eyes before dropping into the pile. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then the smoke thickened suddenly, rising with a deliberate, growing strength. It curled upward through the branches, pushing into the heavy air. The scout exhaled slowly. The real test had just begun. Far in the forest, The lost men had begun to fracture into smaller clusters. Some moved forward with blind determination. Others lingered behind, fearing that every direction led to deeper danger. They were hungry, exhausted, scraped and bruised from moving through undergrowth. Their voices had grown hoarse from calling, but the fog swallowed sound greedily, carrying it no farther than a few meters. It was sheer chance that one of the men spotted the anomaly first, a faint smear floating above the trees, so subtle that he questioned whether it was simply a trick of the light. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. Smoke. Not fog, not mist, smoke. He raised a trembling hand and pointed, his voice cracking as he called the others' attention. Debate erupted. Was it friendly or enemy? Was it real or imagined? But as more men shifted positions, climbing small rises for a clearer view, the truth became undeniable. The shape was organized, rising steadily in a thick column. That could only be deliberate. That could only be meant for them. The discovery ignited a fragile but powerful hope, one that had been fading by the minute. Back at the ridge, the scout fed the fire tirelessly. Every time the wind hesitated or moisture clung to the brush, he adjusted the materials. His arms grew weak. Soot coated his hands, his cheeks, even the collar of his uniform. Sweat mingled with ash. But he didn't stop, not for a sip of water, not even to wipe his stinging eyes. From behind him, the officers observed with uncertain silence. Some paced, some whispered doubts. Others watched the tree line as if expecting the forest to reveal a sign, good or bad. The minutes stretched painfully long. Smoke climbed steadily, but the forest remained still. No voices, no rustling, no approaching shapes. The scout refused to let doubt take root. He knew from the terrain signs that the missing soldiers weren't far. If the smoke stayed consistent long enough, they would see it, orient themselves, and begin the slow, grueling trek back. All he could do was keep the fire alive and trust that the forest hadn't claimed them already. As the lost column pushed toward the source of the plume, the terrain punished them relentlessly. Slopes became treacherous with mud, forcing men to cling to roots to avoid sliding backward. Branches snapped under their weight, tearing at uniforms and scraping bare skin. Yet none complained, not anymore. The smoke gave them a direction, a promise of escape. The higher they climbed, the more visible the plume became. It darkened against the dull sky, unmistakably artificial. Hope spread among the ranks like a spark catching dry tinder. Men who minutes earlier could barely stand now helped each other forward, forming a slow-moving but determined line. Their senses sharpened as they approached familiar terrain, faint echoes of activity, hints of human movement. Some thought they heard distant voices. Others smelled firewood burning. These were the signs of life, of allies, of salvation. They tightened formation and climbed the last incline with hearts pounding in anticipation. At the signal site, tension peaked when faint movement was detected beyond the lower ridge. The officers froze, listening. The scout kept working, adjusting the fire without looking up, trusting the sentries to handle whatever approached. Every crack of a twig, every shift in the wind made nerves tighten. The smoke might save the lost soldiers, but it could just as easily alert the enemy. Defensive positions were reinforced. Rifles were steadied along tree roots and broken stones. Medics prepared supplies in case the approaching figures weren't friendly. The scout's heartbeat quickened, though he never let his hands stop their work. If he allowed fear to interrupt the plume's rise, the lost men might lose their only guide. Time crawled. The fog moved sluggishly across the forest floor, obscuring shapes. For agonizing minutes, the tension held like a drawn bowstring. But no shots were fired. No enemy emerged. Only silence returned, followed soon by the first faint distant sound of shuffling boots from the direction of the lost column. The lost soldiers sensed the change long before they reached the clearing. The air carried the subtle heat of a burning signal fire. Voices, soft, organized, disciplined, echoed faintly through the trees. Their steps quickened, hearts pounded. Fear mingled with anticipation, creating a tension so sharp it almost hurt. Mud clung to their boots as they approached the final incline. Some men slipped and had to be pulled up by their comrades. Others leaned heavily on rifles used as makeshift walking sticks. But when they crested the ridge, the sight froze them in place. A column of smoke rising proudly into the air, and beside it, through a haze of ash and fog, the scout, blackened with soot, still tending the flame. For a moment, no one moved. The forest held its breath. Then a wave of emotion swept through the group: relief, disbelief, exhaustion, and something like awe. They had been pulled back from the edge of disappearance by the simplest signal imaginable. The officers watched in stunned silence as the clearing filled with men, dirty, bruised, hungry, but alive. 300 soldiers, once considered lost, returning not in scattered fragments, but as a unified force. Medics rushed forward, guiding men to sit, distributing water, bandaging wounds. Some soldiers laughed weakly, others wept with relief. A few simply lay on the ground, staring up at the sky, as if amazed it was still there. The scout stepped back quietly, wiping soot from his brow. He wasn't interested in recognition. He simply needed to see the men counted, fed, and stabilized. When one of the officers approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, the scout nodded but said nothing. The moment wasn't his. It belonged to the men who had fought their way back through the maze. News spread quickly among nearby units, a Childish smoke signal rescuing an entire lost column. Soldiers whispered about it around campfires in the days that followed, marveling at the absurd simplicity and impossible success of the act. Night fell gently over the forest, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile peace returned to the ridge. Lanterns flickered among the tents, casting warm glows on the muddy ground. Fog drifted in soft waves, no longer threatening, but almost comforting, reminding the men how close they had come to vanishing within it. The scout sat beside the dying fire, watching the last threads of smoke twist upward into the darkening sky. He didn't feel like a savior or a hero. He felt like someone who simply refused to let fear or ridicule dictate his actions. His instincts, once mocked, had saved 300 men from disappearing forever. And though no official commendation was written that night, every soldier who emerged from the forest carried silent gratitude for the plume that guided them home. In time, the story of the smoke signal became more than an anecdote. It became a reminder that, even in the most mechanized war in history, survival still depended on the human spirit, on ingenuity, instinct, courage, and the willingness to trust something as simple as a rising column of smoke cutting through the fog of a hostile world.